What exactly does it mean to educate the whole child? This philosophy of education prioritizes a holistic approach to educating young people, taking into account not just the content we aim to teach, but also the full range of their social, emotional, and physical well being. In many ways, that's easier said than done. But today we'll talk with an educator from the Lab School in Washington, D.C., whose approach to teaching students with language based learning differences suggests that if we're intentional about the structures we build in schools and the people who are part of a student's learning team, it's more achievable than we thought. Welcome to the what and who of EDU, where we bring you insights from the leading educators, researchers, and innovators shaping the future of teaching and learning. Whether it's exploring new trends in pedagogy, discussing the latest educational research, or diving into real-world classroom strategies, we're your guide to creating a more impactful, inclusive, and effective learning environment. I'm your host, LaShawn Springer. I'm honored today to be joined by Dr. Anthony Perry, Director of Diversity, Equity, Inclusion, and Belonging, and history teacher at the Lab School in Washington, D.C., and board chair for the Kingsbury Wellness and Learning Group. Thank you for joining me, Dr. Perry.
Always. Thanks.
So there's so much actually that I want to talk to you about, but before we dive into your work at the lab school, I think it'd be great to hear about your journey to working in education. So thinking about your own educational philosophy and the different types of schools that you've worked in, would be curious to hear what led you to the lab school ultimately.
Interestingly, time has passed quickly. This is my 19th year working in schools. I started off working in boarding schools. And so I worked at a boarding school in Rhode Island. And I've had this conversation a lot that working in boarding schools really played a part into the way in which I view education, that it's not sort of I just show up in the classroom, do my job, and move on. I think part of working in a boarding school, as you know, is that we are everywhere all of the time. And so those moments of education happen on the way to the dining hall. Those moments happen on the sports field. Those moments happen in the dorm. And part of leaving boarding schools and working in day schools, which is what I eventually did, was that I had in mind that kids had lives outside of my classroom. And so when they showed up to the classroom, I thought about if they were doing a sport, how home life was, if they were tired, if they got enough sleep. And that really played a part into why it is that I moved into DEI work, and in that sort of the larger system that exists for a variety of students. I wanted to make sure that I was playing a part into ensuring that students were able to show up as their full selves, as we keep saying. But that's sort of a gist of the trajectory. I started off in boarding schools, loved working in boarding schools, got tired working in boarding schools, went to
Yeah.
day schools, tried to sort of mimic that same support, recognize that the best way to do that was to be a DEI director. And so that's what I'm doing now.
Yes, I love that. There's a lot you've said already that I want to dig into, and we'll come back around to this idea of thinking about students holistically. But I want to dig into lab a little bit more specifically for folks who are not as familiar. You just gave us a nice brief understanding of what the lab school is, but if you could give us a little bit more, when you're talking to students and you're talking to families, you all talk about what you call the lab difference. And so I would be curious to hear more about how you describe for them the school environment and what that means for them as young people in their development.
So Lab is a school specifically designed for students who have language-based learning differences, and that could be dyslexia, dysgraphia, dyscalculia, and that is their sort of main challenge. They are students, because we recognize that there's intersections. There are students who have ADHD, there are students who are on the spectrum with respect to autism, but our main focus in the work that we are trained to do is around supporting students who have language-based learning differences. And we do that from about first grade through 12th grade. Students aren't necessarily tested as early, so there are fewer kids in the first grade, and we don't have any kindergartners. We have three divisions, so we go from the lower school to the upper school, and we only have about 390 kids, and we have about 195 adults.
Hmm.
So part of what we're able to do is differentiate for our students. I think a lot of schools always say the sort of best practices is that you're differentiating. And I think numbers wise, it's hard to differentiate for a class of 20. It's hard to differentiate for a class of 15 in the time span. But because we only have about 390 students, it's easier for us to do that. And we don't just have a teacher. We have occupational therapists, we have speech language pathologists, we have psychological services. And so all of those individuals work with the teacher to be able to support the student. And so I have a hefty class of 6 this year, and I have a student who works with an occupational therapist. And so she will come to class and not only support that student, but support the work that I'm doing. So she's on my Google Classroom. And so it's really a lot of support systems for students. And thinking about what lab is, that's what it is. It's a place where kids can be themselves. A lot of kids who have dyslexia, dysgraphia, dyscalculia in sort of other schools are made fun of, and this is not a place where that happens for them. This is a place where they are around other people who are like them, and they really feel not ashamed of it. I didn't work in schools like this before, and I had a student, I was on the board trying to spell something, and I was like, can someone help me spell X, Y, and Z? And one of the kids joked, they're like, Dr. Perry, I have dyslexia. You asked me to spell.
Yeah, yeah.
And it wasn't that they couldn't spell, it's just that's a part of the culture where we joke about it.
Yeah.
And that's really what kids experience, that they really feel a sense of relief of being able to just show up as their full selves here.
Yeah, that's beautiful because I'm really appreciating hearing the ways in which students are really fully able to take also some ownership in their education in ways that empower them that they haven't felt before, right? If they were in these communities, school communities where they were feeling like they did not belong, they were feeling like they didn't have the abilities and capabilities to now be in a space that allows them to co-create their own learning experiences alongside their instructors seems like a really empowering place to be. Let's get into the specifics of what this looks like at lab. Thinking about what are things that could be replicated in other spaces, recognizing that as much as we could and should and want schools that really are intentionally built from the ground up for our young people, regardless of where they stand, we know that's not the reality of our educational system and our spaces today. So, what specifically have you all built, or what are some of the functions that exist at lab school that another educator might be able to say, okay, I need to think about how I replicate this in my community?
Yeah, I will say that it is a difficult financial endeavor to have a school this size with this many adults. And part of the work that we're doing with institutional advancement is trying to ensure that we can continue to do the work that we do. I would say, with respect to the things that I've learned that are necessary, I think having at my disposal occupational therapists, speech language pathologists, people who really know how to support our students and just being able to go to them with any question that I have has been so helpful. And I think there are lots of schools that are expanding their learning specialists. I think that they have to be intentional in who they're hiring as learning specialists. I think within our school, there are people who are learning specialists because they're teachers who teach students who have language-based learning differences. But there's a difference between that teacher and a person who's a speech language pathologist. Like that individual has a broader skill set to be able to support not only the student who has the language-based learning difference, but who can support all of the students. And so I think being intentional in what your support network looks like for your students and not just being like, oh, we have a learning specialist. Boom. One of the more important things that's coming up in the news and all around is how kids are learning how to read. And so I think that part of the conversation is, what is your practice? What are the practice of your school around teaching younger kids to read? Are your teachers qualified and trained to be able to teach people to
Yeah.
read? I think there's just an assumption that because I can read, I can
Yeah.
teach other people to read. And one of the things that I learned quickly was I cannot teach kids to read. Go to my lower school, and the way in which teachers understand sort of how syllables work, how pronunciation works, how words come together. I sat there and I was like, that's how you teach how to read. I think that the system that I was in benefited me because I was not neurodivergent, but the way in which it's explained to me how you read is so helpful for me being able to do my work in the high school because I can recognize what are the sort of impediments that my students will run into. And I can go back to, remember in the lower school when you learned about this type of word, let's go back to that. Or remember when you learned transition words. I think part of what I've learned a lot is to be intentional in how it is that we provide knowledge to students, and that you have to be skilled.
Yeah, I love that because there really is a team of people behind each of your young people as they're thinking about their learning experience and their learning journey. I'm curious about the training for the adult community. I think our educators really are stretched for a number of different reasons, right? We're still not fully recovered from COVID in terms of what that means for what the classroom looks like and where our young people are in their own social and educational development. And it's also not like prior to COVID, we had all the answers right either. So we're still learning. But I think one thing that always has been a struggle in the classroom is thinking about the time ban that teachers have, and you have content that you want to teach. But then there's also this type of work that you're doing with occupational therapists or with other subject matter experts at your school that are great pedagogical practices that support the work that you are going to be doing, or working with an instructional designer, right, to help you think about whether your course is going to meet the needs of your young people. So I'm just curious to hear about like the training that you all do, or even if you can talk a little bit about how you balance as a teacher, thinking about the content that you want to teach, and then all of maybe some of what we sometimes take for granted as really great strategies and practices and pedagogy that support the learning and facilitation of the content that you're trying to teach our young people.
Yeah, so the lower school and the middle school is where reading happens, where the learning about reading happens. And so they do the science of reading, they do Orton Gillingham. I'm not the best at explaining the sort of nuances of that, but the teachers who come in usually are, we call it OG trained. They're usually OG trained about how it is they can teach reading. And so that's how we approach reading. And the people who come in, teachers, usually have that experience, and we provide at different intervals, sort of a re-up of the experience of being OG trained. And I have, in order to support the work that I do around designing curriculum for belonging time, which we have here around identity development work, have worked with teachers so I understand how that works, so that when I'm trying to prepare lessons for the lower school, that I have in mind the amount of words that can be on a page. One of the things that's been helpful for me in the middle school is how our students learn vocabulary and how I should teach vocabulary. And so part of it is we have something called because, but, so there's also all these things. And so part of it is what are some of the things that our students have learned about learning vocabulary that I can pull into belonging time, that I can pull into identity work, where they feel like, oh, this is just like learning some vocabulary word in their English classes. But I would say that specifically, I have created a curriculum for identity development work from the lower school through the high school. And part of being able to do that is working with teachers around, is this accessible, right? And thinking about, you mentioned pace, right? Like, given who our students are, can they read this amount in the time that we've allotted? For example, with the middle school, I will have sentence starters. So it's an activity for them, but there's a sentence starter that helps them to think about what it is that I want from them. And so those things are important in the middle school. Sometimes I put them in the high school, but the scaffolding isn't as necessary. So I would say that the specific things are around how it is that we think about the input that students are getting, recognizing that the input has to be multiple times, it has to come in different forms. And that's really helped with my teaching, that I will talk about something where I will give a lesson on it, then they will read about it, then they'll watch a video on it, and then we'll read about it again. And a recognition that they need multiple iterations and in different forms to be able to be successful. And that came out of just a conversation with one of the speech language pathologists. I was like, hey, so this student in particular didn't get it the first time. And one of the things that we get here at Lab is we get the testing profile of students. And so part of my job is to read the profile of all the students. That lists what they need to be successful. And that's how I manage my class. And so if there's lots of students who, so for example, I've had a student who it's difficult for him to watch videos. So part of the benefit of only having 6 students is like, okay, so we're going to watch a video just so that you're aware if it gets too much, this is the reading assignment that you can go and do. So you're getting the same information and you don't have to necessarily be in class for it. And so we're able to differentiate for our students in that way because the classes are small and because I have a profile of them and I know how they work.
Yeah. I think one of my favorite moments working in schools, well, I have a couple, but I always love the aha moments for students and young people. And because you just brought up one of your goals is really helping them understand how they learn. I'm wondering if you have a story about one of your students that is that aha moment for them of their recognition of self-advocacy, self-efficacy of what it is that they need from you as a teacher, from the school in general, as they've come to this understanding of how they learn best.
There are so many moments. This is the fifth year that I teach a class, History of People of Color of America. And this is the
Mhm.
fifth year that I've taught this class and it has not looked the same. The beginning has changed multiple times. And
Mhm.
that's a result of what the students are interested in. We were reading some chapter of one of our textbooks and it was about covenants. And the kids were like, "What are covenants?" And I was like, "What?" And so we like, got on just this distraction of what covenants are. And I was like, "Oh, there's a new TV show out, Them, where it starts off with covenants." And they're like, "Oh, can we watch it?" And I was like, "Sure." And one of the funny things about my class is kids who are not in my class are like, "You watch a lot of television or movies in your class?" And so like, "I do." And one of the kids was like, "Yeah, but he ruins them." And I was like, "What do you mean?" They're like, "We can't watch anything without like overthinking." And I was like,
Yeah.
"That's what I want you to do." Uh,
Yeah.
because especially with this age group of kids, is we always have these conversations about media literacy. And part of what I want to
Mhm.
also teach them is media literacy. They're getting ideas about the world from TikTok, from Reels, from every television show they watch, every movie that
Yeah.
they watch. And I want them to think about why it is that this is the thing that we've decided to talk about. And one of the sort of best things that happened in my class was I left to go do something. I came back and they're watching, what is this show called? Thomas the Tank Engine. Is that I don't know if it's Thomas the Tank Engine or whatever it's called. Something like that,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
I know. You're like, where's this story going? And
Yeah.
I was like, why are we watching this? And they're like,
Mhm.
"Dr. Perry, this is about fascism." And I was like, what? And they was
Yeah.
like, well, what you've taught us and what we've talked about, because we talked about
Mhm.
fascism and power. And
Yeah.
they're like, it's really like, there's really a differentiation between the types of cars and trucks and like trains and where they
Mm.
can be. And I was like, I think that you're just trying to get me to watch this show. And I was like, okay, fine. We'll watch it at the end of the school year. We'll watch it. I watched that and I was like, oh my God, wow. And part of it was like, I love that they were able to use the information that we had talked about
Yeah.
to be able to really engage with a television show in a way that they were like, it starts from the beginning. Like you're enculturated from the
Mm.
beginning. I was like, yeah, you are,
Yeah.
because one of the kids asked, why is it that this person is seen as less than because they're dirty, because they're a dirty car, but part of their job as a train is to carry dirty things. So why are we judging them based on that? And I was like, that is a great question. And so
Yeah.
those are the ways in which I think in which we do things allow students to problem solve.
Yeah, that's beautiful. The other thing that I really loved about working in schools was watching young people relate to each other. And I always love watching the bonds that they form with one another, even though we all dealt with our fair share of also friendship drama. But I'm curious because of the type of environment that you all are building and have built, whether you see a difference in how your young people relate to one another that feels different than what you've seen in other schools.
I'm on the strategic planning committee, and we've talked a lot about like a lab student. And it's one of those things where you know when you see one and you know when you experience one. So, for example, one of the things that I think I've recognized in teaching is that we're very much about like control. So I don't have a better way to say this, but when we're
Yeah.
having meetings, everyone's quiet. This is how it functions. No, blah, blah. And I continue that because it's easier to convey information when people are quiet. And I have meetings with the whole middle school. So it's 180 kids from fifth grade to eighth grade in a theater with a good chunk of them with ADHD. Girl, what's going to happen? Right. But part of it is like a recognition that the only reason that I'm able to do that is because I know all of them. Right. There are 180
Mm.
kids and I know who needs movement, who needs to stand up, who needs to do that. And they know that about each other. And so one of the beautiful things about the kids is like, so I have this kid, Charlie, and he's an amazing kid. The level of happiness that exists for him is just unparalleled. And I think that's really much tied to coming to a school where he could show up, be loud, talk over people, stand up, walk around. And that's what everyone else is doing. So he feels at home. And so I was giving a presentation. I do the teachery thing where I like do a little call and response. The response was a little weak. And I was like, but there was one kid whose response was not weak. And that was Charlie's response.
Yeah,
And
Charlie.
and so I was like, y'all, what we need to do is we need to get on Charlie's level, right? Like it's a space where kids don't feel like that it's some sort of competition because I've called out Charlie. They know Charlie does what he's supposed to, blah, blah. Cool. And so everyone was like, okay, we're going to do it. We're going to, rise to Charlie's level. But Charlie, being Charlie, was like, oh no, then I have to go up higher, right? So like everyone comes to Charlie's level and Charlie's higher. And I was like, Charlie, yo, love you, but we can't keep raising the bar. He was like, why, Dr. Perry? You tell us to raise the bar. But that is something that I can do in a space of 180 kids where they're also adults and the kids are like supportive of each other. The kids have learned this and thinking about their language-based learning differences. One of the things we talk to them about is how we have conversations where we build off of what the previous person has said. And so we give them words of like, to piggyback off of X, Y, and Z. And that became a running joke with my kids. But they do that in larger meetings, right? So they're listening to what X student is saying, and they're like, oh, to piggyback off of what this student said, I agree. Because part of what we've recognized is that we're a community and we're a group and we work together. And they've really done that and they fight for each other. Yes, they have language-based learning differences and they have that as a similarity, but there are a lot of differences. Race, class, gender, sexual orientation, all those things. And the tools that we've given them as students to advocate for their language-based learning difference, they use for all of the things. And so fifth graders show up at my office, Dr. Perry, such and such said such and such. How are we going to deal with that, right? And so part of it is that way where they're dealing with someone who's done something that's caused harm, but also they want to support someone. They're like, oh, such and such isn't having a good day. How do we support them? I think my experience has been that the kids are really empathetic. I think they've had to live a life in which people haven't given them that same level of empathy that they deserve. And so they're really hyper aware of when something isn't fair, and they really work hard to ensure fairness. Again, middle schoolers, they're still middle schoolers, so they're still growing. So fairness sometimes is different for them than what it is in real life. But I think that the students are, I don't know, they really show up for each other in a way that I haven't seen at other places. I can walk down the hall, ask a student where another student is, and within like 5 minutes, they'll be like, oh, Dr. Perry is looking for you, and they'll go find them. I had a kid today, I was like, I don't know where my computer is. I think I left it in the room. He was like, I'll go get it. Right. And so though that's just, it's a community. It has the aspect of boarding school, of being a community in a way that I haven't found at other day schools.
Wow. Thank you for sharing those stories about the lab community with us. And I know I'll be thinking about how I can bring some Charlie level energy to the spaces I'm in as well. Well, that is a perfect place for us to end. You have shared so much with us already, Dr. Perry, and I know we could talk for another hour, but we have to get you off to class, and I know your students are clamoring at the door to meet with you. Thank you for joining us, Dr. Perry, and thank you to all of our listeners for joining us as well. Before we go, I do want to leave you with a couple of the highlights I took away from our conversation today, recognizing that it won't be possible for every school to employ the team of experts that are available at the lab school. There are still ways that you can cultivate learning spaces that honor the whole child. Dr. Perry reminds us that when we do have access to specialists, whether it be instructional designers or learning specialists, it's imperative to see those folks as your close partners in the work. When possible, invite students to co-create their own learning experiences, giving them a sense of agency and ownership over their education. And finally, as we know, all students deserve to be in schools where they feel seen, heard, and a sense of belonging. This is the what and who of EDU. Together, we've been exploring teaching and learning best practices from schools, colleges, and universities that fall outside the archetype, intentionally designed to meet the full needs of their student population. I'm your host, LaShawn, and I invite you to tune into our next episode.